Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Velero community meeting / open discussion. Today is February 1st, 2022. If you haven't already, please add your name to the list here, to the attendee list. It's always lovely to see all the names filled out there. I'm going to dive into status updates, and then we have a few discussion topics. I don't think Eleanor will be joining us today, so I'll be talking about those a bit. That's about it. So status updates, we got Dave.
Yeah, so I'm just, I have the item snapshotter an update progress PR that I put in, and just addressing comments, working on addressing comments from Daniel, and hopefully we can get that merged soon.
Awesome. Can you add in the PR number there to the?
Sure, let me find it.
Cool, thank you. I see Scott joined as well. Do you have any status updates for us, Scott? Calling you out.
Yeah. No, not really. I mean, I guess the one thing is we have a follow-on from Shubham proposal of design issue that I've been participating on with Shubham and Dylan on. But in terms of core Velero stuff, not really, other than PR review.
Right. Awesome. Thank you. All right, let's dive into the discussion topics for today. So last week we had a community meeting late at night here in the US, early morning over in China. So I wanted to just make people aware of the discussions that we had. Please watch the recording if you haven't already, but we also documented the things here. So the first one is community support for older versions. So I wanted to just make you all aware of this. We haven't explicitly stated what number of versions we're actually supporting. We've just essentially said it's best effort, and then we'll try not to update a bunch of later versions, but it hasn't been documented which versions we actually do support. So we Eleanor opened this up a few months ago, and then we had a really good discussion last week. And the community meeting that we had last week, we agreed on N-1 support. And the plan is to post this out in Slack, which I think she already did, and then out to the distro list. That's still to be done. Any questions, comments on this? Everyone okay with this? All right, awesome. Yeah, so this will be, that'll be easier as well to handle the compatibility matrix and just making sure that we put support efforts where they're really needed. One thing that we talked about in the compatibility matrix is that, so if we support 1.8 right now and the -1, so 171 here, we're supporting Kubernetes versions from 1.12 up to latest. So that's a lot of Kubernetes versions. This will change when 1.9 ships, because then the supported Kubernetes versions will bump up to 116 to latest.
Do we have any concept of a LTS that we'll be supporting?
Not at the moment. I think that would be a really good discussion topic, though.
I agree. It feels like at a certain point, you might have to have an LTS support version for customers who have longer upgrade paths or times. Yep. So I would like for us to at least consider that when we're designing this support policy.
Can you please add your some comments into here around LTS? Because I think that's that would
yep,
be
I will do. Yep,
awesome.
Will do.
Yeah, don't because we're looking at 1.9, so maybe 1.10 would be, I don't know, if we were to go that route, 1.10 could be the the first LTS, and then we'll see what versions we would support. So yeah, I think that would be good. It's a really good discussion to have, Sean. Thank you. All right. Also related to support is how we handle community support. This was a lively discussion last week. So again, if you haven't watched the recording, please do. So this is essentially what we talked about and what we thought would be a good idea. So the goals here would be to encourage Velero users to help each other. This is in Slack, in mailing lists, and elsewhere. And also encourage every maintainer to decide the amount of community support they do. So that would be all maintainers for the Velero project, and look at what kind of support they can handle, and make sure that we just hit that. Is it 1 hour a week? Is it 10 hours a week? How much support in Slack and for support issues can we handle? The third point and the third goal here would be to make documentation better. I mean, better is a very subjective measurement, but make it easier to find things maybe, so users can help themselves better, and non-engineers like Eleanor, like me, can help users better as well. And then make sure that our users in Slack, mostly because that's where we have the majority of support questions, feel like the Velero team, the maintainer team, is present. This would allow the developers, the maintainers, to spend most of their time on feature development and not support. So one of the things that we looked at is we don't need to respond immediately, but we need to agree that it's okay for a maintainer to take up to, not necessarily 48 hours, but up to 48 hours to respond to support requests. Longer than that, then I don't think we fulfill goal number 4. If it takes more than 48 hours to get a response, we're not really present. So if we can agree on that, I think that would be super good. And then respond to queries. That doesn't mean solve the issue, but respond in, yeah, giving them help, pointing them in the right direction. And one thing that we looked at was especially around debugging. Debugging can take a lot of time. So we want to make sure that harder questions are filed as issues, because that way they don't get lost in Slack, but rather we have them as issues. We can continue to track them and see how we can handle things. We've had support conversations in Slack, in the Velero users channel. We've had a bunch of support discussions that have started and not been responded to. So we definitely want to make sure that we may change that. So one of the things that was discussed last week was to skip the discussion board. So we'll essentially just remove the support Q&A discussion forum, or the discussion tag, or whatever you want to call it, that we have pointed to before, because discussions don't pop up as easily on maintainers' radar, so they can get missed. So it's easier to point people towards having creating an issue. And we also need a proper debug issue or a support issue GitHub template. So there are a few things that we need to put in motion, but first and foremost, the thing that we want to move towards is having issues on GitHub. That way we can track everything, we can have proper documentation, and it's long-lived and it's not lost in Slack after a day or two. Thoughts, comments?
Have we considered putting GitHub discussions instead of Slack?
I'm sorry. Yeah, we already have GitHub discussions for that, but sometimes they don't get answered quickly. So, and they don't really pop up as issues. It's not something that the maintainers go to every day. So a lot of those discussions were missed. We saw several that had been just sitting for 2 or more weeks without a response. And this was something that we agreed upon last year, that we wanted to drive towards discussions, but we saw that that kind of fell through. So instead we looked at, okay, what do the Velero maintainers look at? Well, we look at issues. So driving towards issues was seen as the better route.
Yeah, I think we tried discussions, and one of the issues there was that if it escalated into something that was actually a bug, there wasn't an easy path from discussions to issue. So that was why we said, just, if it looks like you're actually having a problem, you should make an issue. And discussions were supposed to be for just like, what can I back up?
Yeah, so issues, because then we can also, the thought was here, because you can take a discussion and just transform it into an issue. And that's pretty easy. But with discussions, we don't have templates. And if you want to have good support, it's easier to have a template. So we're going to have a good an issue template for support questions, where we ask, add your logs here. Here's the format that we need. What version are you using? What are you running on? So having that template so people can fill that out, so we can more easily debug, instead of spending 15 to 20 minutes asking those questions to get the information that we need.
This might be a difference of opinion, but I just feel like sometimes Slack often feels like a synchronous communication method, whereas something that's more asynchronous would be helpful, especially with the maintainer team being, distributed across multiple time zones. I was just thinking that would be helpful, but I understand like most people only look at Slack, so it was just a thought that I had.
No, Slack is great, but what we've seen is that when someone asks a question in Slack, they ask a question, they don't get a response within like 30 minutes. They walk away, then one of the maintainers jump in, ask a question, and they don't get a response until the next day. So it's like, okay, did I help you? I don't know what's happening. I still don't have the information that I need to actually give you more information either. So driving towards this and having a standardized way for issues will hopefully help with that back and forth. And then you can always discuss more in Slack or over Zoom or what have you. But just starting the issues and having the right information there, so we can have that as a starting point. Slack is great. I love Slack, but things get lost. Especially if you helped someone last week, you have to go back and you're like, oh, where is that thread? Well, on GitHub, it's much easier to just go through it. And it also helps for visibility. If someone searches for that same issue later on, the GitHub response will be recorded and can be found in search engines, while Slack cannot. So that's also a really big thing. If we have the answers, the error messages, the replies, the answer to the question solved there, then people can see like, oh, that's how they got to the right method of doing X. So hopefully that can help as well when we build out docs and we see the recorded, well, not necessarily building out docs, but having responses at least. Because then if someone comes in and it's like, yeah, I have this issue, and they're like, yeah, have a look at issue 234 where we solved this. You make some good points though, Sean. So yeah, we can add a guideline that have discussions, get unanswered for 2 days, create an issue. Yeah, I think we'll try to move away from these discussions here and just do issues. So questions on Slack. If they're easy, if they're like product related, just product related or feature related, then yeah, those are questions we can just reply to. But if they're the issues that I'm talking about here are mostly support issues. So those would be the big ones. So the plan is for us to try this out, see if it works, see if it helps with communication and support load on the maintainers. And if it doesn't work, we'll try something else. We tried with discussions and it didn't really work. We tried with Slack. It can be super hard to keep track of things. So we'll try this. If this doesn't work, we'll see if we can do something else. All right. Any other questions, comments on this? All right. So one last big thing, as you all might have noticed, Velero.io is no longer accessible, which is a bummer for sure. So it turns out that the domain was registered to a former employee. It was transferred, but the transfer wasn't done correctly, it seems. So right now we're trying to figure out where the domain is actually registered. So in the meantime, we're looking at different ways of regaining control over the domain. We have other domains that we can use in the meantime. Velero.netlify.app works fairly okay, but we also have project Velero.io that I am working on getting set up so we can use that as a fallback. So if Velero.io is unreachable for a longer amount of time, we'll have project Velero.io that we can use. So that's the plan moving forward. I'm still working with our IT department on getting everything set up. So that should be done hopefully today or tomorrow. We can use project Velero.io and then we'll see about the original domain. That's one. So that's a quick update for you all. All right, next up we have Dylan and then Shubham.
Hey, this one should be pretty quick. So I just want to call out that I submitted 2 fixes to the GCP and Azure plugins. It's a CVE with the UID package. And the main Velero repo actually fixed this a little while back. I just think we forgot to catch the plugins. But I wanted to call this out in case I didn't look at like the vSphere plugin. I didn't look at all the plugins, only ones that really I was aware of and consuming, but I would just do a double check. If anyone's using the Satori UID package, you should update. The one in Velero, it seems to be the one that everyone's switching to, Go RFS. So changes are pretty simple, but I just want to call this out in case there's other plugins that are using this. I didn't look at every single one. So just a heads up. That's really all there is for that one.
Thanks, Dylan. Yeah, awesome. I see Scott has already responded there. Dave, are you on the maintainer group right now? I think you got added properly yesterday.
Yes, I can. You mean want to review it and kick in? Yeah, I can take a look.
Yeah, that'd be good. I want to make sure that the CVEs don't linger. Okay, awesome. All right, Shubham and Dylan.
So I have a design doc for making some changes to restore workflow. It is related to the 4066 issue. So currently, so do you guys want to take a look at it before discussion?
Shimon, can you just give the high level overview of the problem we're trying to solve?
Yeah.
Then
Sure thing.
maybe
So,
asynchronously people can look at the proposal.
Currently, whenever we do a restore and Velero checks that for a particular Kubernetes object, whether it exists in the cluster or not, whether the instance of that resource exists in the cluster or not. If it exists, or if it even doesn't, it skips the restore, right? So we wanted to make some changes to that workflow. So this is a design doc regarding the same. We won't be changing anything regarding the behavior of service account objects. So that will be the same. And this design doc has 3 approaches to it. Mainly, we want to add a spec called existing resource policy to the restore API. This policy would enable the user to decide whether to perform whether to go with the current restore workflow and do nothing, or whether to do a patch or merge the specs if there is any diff found, if there is diff observed in the Kubernetes object present in the backup and the in cluster version. And there is also a proposal for a recreate object if it consists of immutable spec fields. But we are considering that as a non-goal and a future scope feature for this enhancement. So we have 3 approaches regarding this spec field.
And I just wanted to call out that nothing would change in the default behavior. So if you didn't specify anything different, we would do what we currently do, which is, we check to see if the resource is there and it's the same, then we're good. If it's there and it's different, the default behavior is we just we create a warning. But this would give the user an option to say, no, I want to patch this instead. And the different approaches basically the first approach is kind of the all-in-one approach of, for the entire restore, do the same thing. The second approach says would allow us to kind of using the includes excludes feature to be able to say, actually, I want to merge deployments, but not secrets or whatever. I mean, that would provide the additional flexibility, obviously additional complexity. And the other thing is that the whole the recreate's the one that is potentially problematic in terms of that one's potentially destructive. So what we're saying for now, let's ignore it. It's a possible future feature, but we have to be careful about adding it because basically, if you're doing a patch and the patch fails, you still haven't modified the cluster. So that kind of falls back to it's a warning and it's what we do now. The problem with the recreate is that you're potentially destroying the cluster resources. So that's kind of a dangerous option that, we may still people may want it as an available option in the future. We need to be careful in implementing it and in documenting that, use this at your own risk. But the basic issue here is this is to help in case, one possible case is if you have a secondary cluster where you're using it as kind of a live cluster replication of the current cluster and you're updating things, you want to be able to update things that exist already. And there was an existing issue, I think I linked to it there, where there has been some discussion. I know Frankie had some comments there as well. And I know there were concerns saying, hey, we're potentially breaking things here. And that's one of the reasons why with this proposal, we're saying the default behavior is no change from what Velero currently does. This would just be an option that users could choose, as an additional modification of behavior if they really do, and again, the use case here is, one of them is you have this kind of backup cluster that you want to keep in sync. So at that point, you're saying whatever is in the backup takes precedence over what's in the cluster. And obviously in the normal case where you've done a restore and then things are different, the default behavior is saying, hey, I trust the cluster over the backup, and then we don't do anything here. So that's kind of the basic idea here. Because we've had people that have, and I've seen at least one upstream issue. There may have been other ones where other Velero users have wanted something like this, and we've got cases where people we're working with also are wanting something like this as well. So that's why we've proposed it.
So I know we've gotten a lot of requests for this.
Yeah.
And I think it's definitely worthwhile investigating, but I would, well, one, you really need to work this through with Daniel, because this is going to be with him. I really think it needs to be well documented. I think need to do a bunch of discussion about the scenarios and stuff,
Yep.
and what's actually going to happen.
Absolutely.
I don't
and
see.
then that's part of why we had the the design PR, which I think at this point may be the best, again, because of the time zone differences. That maybe that working through on that may be a good way of starting that process of discussing, not just
Yeah.
the specifics of the design, but also, are we missing something in these approaches? Is there some use case that isn't considered? Is there something about these approaches that's going to break something for existing users? We need to hash out all of that before we write any code, obviously.
Yeah, so I don't see a mention of PVs, and PVs sound like a hard problem.
Yeah, I guess part of and again, our thinking here was that, if you want PVs where you want to update existing volumes, to some degree, Restic, that's kind of where Restic comes in. But I know we're trying to get away from Restic. I mean, the issue is with snapshots. The only way to do that is to nuke it and start over.
Well, actually, vSphere has the wonderful option to revert to a snapshot. It has to be a local snapshot, but the issue is that if the system's running, you'll crash the kernel.
Yeah.
And even with overwriting files, if you have files that are open, unless you restart the pods, odds are you'll either break what's in the files, or they start writing to files that no longer exist and things disappear. So I think PVs are difficult. I also think that it's going to be part of the expectation with this. So we really need to, like if you're trying to keep two clusters in sync, people are going to ask for, geez, how are we, it doesn't help if I don't keep my PVs in sync.
Right.
Well, but I think it's I just want to call out that I don't think we're really trying to solve that problem in this design. Like, I get what you're saying, that at a high level, it's a similar need and requirement.
That's the use case you just gave me.
For volume data, no.
Well, if the use case, I see what you're saying is that if the use case is a backup cluster that you keep in sync with the main cluster, solving the Kubernetes resource is part of the solution. Dealing with Kubernetes resources is part of the solution, but dealing with PVs is another part. And yeah, I don't know that. The thing is, this is an approach to what we do in the Restic, the Velero main restore. How we handle on-disk data, I think, is part of the larger problem. Whether you wanted to scope that as part of this and say there's a secondary component to the implementation that's in a completely different place, or whether that's a different feature that's in parallel that you would need to use them together, that's less clear to me. But
yeah, I would definitely go through and put that into the top level design, exactly what's not being covered, because what will happen is people will use this, and then they're going to start filing bugs.
I think we did call that out as in the non-goals, but maybe we need more detail.
Yeah, it doesn't say anything about PVs, for example.
Yeah. We're saying non-Kubernetes. I guess that's kind of vague, because PVs are Kubernetes resources, but the content is not managed by Kubernetes. Right. So, we should probably call that out explicitly, saying for this discussion here, this solution doesn't deal with PVs. There may be a separate discussion about, as I said, I know with Restic we have done that, but like you said, the applications need to not be running when you're doing that kind of thing.
Right. We can do things like scale up, scale down. So Raphael was working on this for the migration, and you can scale down the destination pod, for example, replica set.
Yeah,
and
Restic can update a volume that has data on it.
We could whack the PV and create a new one, right? I mean, that could be part of the process. What I'm saying is, there's going to be expectations. There's going to be things like, for example, you upgrade the version of software on one side. That upgraded the format on the disk.
Yeah, and I would say, if you want to take the approach of nuke the PV and create a new one, that goes back to the recreate option that we're saying we want to do. But that's
what I'm saying is, let's work through the scenarios.
Yeah,
and let's come up with things that are going to work, things that may work in the future, things will never work, and have a good set of stuff. Because
that makes sense. Because certainly the PVs, I think that goes back to this future case of, the recreate option, and this again focuses on that approach too, where we can specify on a resource basis. So we might say that the default is patch, but for PVs, patching the PV resource is kind of useless in this context. Instead, what you want to do is you want to delete the PV, recreate the PV. That brings with it all the other complications around finalizers and timeouts and waiting. But if you solve all that, then deleting the PV in PVC and then recreating them, because and that's the other problem, is that right now Velero distinguishes the Kubernetes resource is the backup and the live object the same. Well, the PVC Kubernetes object might be the same. That doesn't mean that the content in the underlying volume is the same. So that might be a decisional complication, because right now the Velero notion of is it the same is exclusively relating to, well, I don't need to recreate this Kubernetes resource because the Kubernetes resources on disk is the same as what we have, which ignores the fact that for PVCs, most of the data is not in that YAML, it's on a disk somewhere.
Yep. Yeah, I think, what we see, I think in support is we get a fair amount of people have how things should work in their mind.
Yep.
And it's not necessarily well explained, or, it differs, but we get an awful lot of, geez, why doesn't Velero overwrite the resources?
Yep.
It always comes down to, why doesn't it do what I want it to do?
Exactly.
And I think we should work through a lot of like the what they wanted to do cases.
Yep.
And then explain to them why it's not going to do that, or what.
Right. And in the context here, and
can we hold on? Can I jump in? Yeah, I think that an important aspect of this is that we're delegating almost all of the content within a PV to other things at this point, right? Either RESTIC and the options we choose, or CSI and the options that you have with CSI, and snapshotting and volume content, and what those individual CSI plugins can support, or what a given item snapshotter can support. All of those things are really important, but I think they're outside the scope of what we're attempting to do here, right? Like, I think that this is way more focused on something like, I want to keep my deployment information in sync. And I think you bring up a good point around, you upgraded this, it's not going to move the data over, but we're already delegating the movement of data to some other thing. So even if it wasn't an upgrade and I needed to move the data over, I already had to solve that in some way. So I don't know if those individual scenarios are drastically different than the overall use case, which is that we want to keep the Kubernetes resources up to date, but the underlying data is already being delegated. And I wonder if we could just say that out loud and just all agree on that, and then to focus on the Kubernetes resources. And
I'm saying that all these things need to be said out loud. It needs to be documented really well, because the discussion that we have
agree.
is not the discussion that the users hear.
And they don't. I need to document it and then include that.
Hold on.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, hold on. I agree with what you just said, and I think that was communicated, at least in my opinion, inside the enhancement when it says non-Kubernetes resources.
No, it does not communicate to our average user. It really does not. It has to be explicit. So that's part of the thing that we have to write out.
Well, then I think we probably need to do a set of education on what Velero is doing in regards to the underlying data, because it sounds like to me, at least from what I've seen over the past, is that we are mostly delegating all of this problems into other systems.
So data mover
probably need to make it
is on the path, and that handles some of the data movement. But no, I agree with you. But the thing
even
is,
data movers are going to delegate, right? Like even data movement is going to be a delegation to some other tool. So either we have to add some sort of interfaces to do this or whatnot.
Not really. The one we have right now, can read from various APIs and write to various APIs. My point being that this is a feature that has a lot of spinning shiny blades, and people will use it. They will cut themselves, and then they come over and they go, "Oh my God, what's wrong?" And it's not fun. So
I think part of what you're saying is solved by just spelling out when you say non-Kubernetes resources, part of what we mean is content on disk and PVs, and just being explicit about that.
Yes. And work through some of the scenarios. Here's things you can do. Here's things you can't do.
The other thing I would say is that I think we may even be able to, in at least a kind of brute force way, handle some of those PV issues. For example, once we get to this phase 2 where we say we want to do the recreate thing, and there's another possibility here again in trying to determine behavior, because right now we have two things. Is the thing different on disk versus, in the backup? And then what do we do? One possibility is there may be an additional Boolean on this behavior, or a multiplication of options to say, hey, for these resource types, I want you to recreate it even if it looks the same to you. In other words, Velero is not smart enough to know that some config file in that volume is tweaked. So I'm telling you, when you restore this volume, nuke the PV and recreate it, even if Velero thinks the PV is not changed. That may be a way of forcing that within this framework, because you basically just defined another set of behavior to say, because right now we're saying, okay, there's this if else block where if the thing is not changed, we do nothing, and if it's changed, we have an option of do nothing, patch it, delete and recreate it. Well, you've doubled your options if you say we also have the option to patch and recreate, not patch, because if it's the same as basically the recreate option might have a secondary really recreate option to say, for these resources, always delete the thing if you find it and recreate it. And that would be a brute force way of handling your PV thing, even if your, for example, snapshot provider doesn't support incremental restores. So you can't do the whole restic thing, whatever, around updating live volumes. That would fit within this framework with not a lot of changes. Again, that wouldn't be a phase 1 thing here, because I think this first approach says we follow the Velero logic of saying, if the thing's the same as far as Velero understands, we ignore it. If it's different, we have some choices.
I'm not arguing with you about ways to go. I think you presented some decent ways to go. What I'm saying is, let's lay out the scenarios and know what's going to happen. Think about some of the things the users are going to expect, and are we meeting those expectations or not?
And adding more scenarios doesn't necessarily mean more code. It might mean more things on the non-goal section.
Absolutely. And in the documentation, like, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do.
That way a user doesn't look at this and say, wait a minute, hey, my PV didn't change, it's a bug.
Yep.
No, it's not. Read the doc.
Yeah, so Scott and Dave, Dylan raised a really good question here. Design enhancements are not for users, they're for maintainers. They do drive documentation and feature work though. So yeah, being explicit definitely helps, but I think we beating a dead horse here, right?
Yeah.
How about this? It sounds like, Dave, you have some of these scenarios in your mind that you really want to make sure are covered. Could you write them as a comment on the enhancement? And Shubham can go and update the enhancement to cover those scenarios.
Yeah.
If anybody else has any other scenarios, we can add them to the enhancement, and we can add them as use cases, and we can get the answers inside that. And that would be the next step here.
And I think that this is really an area for, you've got scenarios that you're trying to satisfy. Write those down as well. So here's my experience.
Well, I think they're already
a backup
there.
product.
That's my point.
And this is for Macs, and so went to end users. And one of the features was clone. Now, if you clone one disk to another disk, what do you expect will happen? So in my mind, your destination winds up being exactly the same as your source. That's how I implemented it. You will go through and you will delete things that are not in the source from the destination. And users kept using this. And my first month of shipping this feature was complete hell, because they wiped their disks and all of a sudden they are having, complete meltdowns. It's like, it's clone. It tells you it's going to make it exactly the same.
Yeah, I mean, I have no disagreement with the fact that, it's actually the same way today with how folks use Velero's restore and what they expect to happen versus what, is actually documented what's supposed to happen. I'm all in favor of over documenting what exactly we're trying to do, but I just want to call out the design enhancement covers with the 3 approaches, the different use cases that we already have customers asking us to use Velero for.
Yeah.
So
So do we have those use cases written down?
Yeah, the approaches are attempting to solve exact problems that
No,
customers.
but in the design, does it discuss the use cases? I didn't see that.
In other words, a separate section that just says, here's what it should do without regard to in the end of the approaches. I guess I'm not sure that's separated right now.
Yeah, those are kind of things so that when you look at it, you go, here's what you're trying to do. Does it satisfy that?
Sure. Yeah. So we can happily add a new section there.
Yeah. And again, I think some of what Dave's suggesting ultimately just ends up being maybe another couple of lines or a paragraph that may end up in the non-goal section. Just being clear on, if we're saying certain things are out of scope, let's be clear in a way that no one would, be confused, or someone's going to be confused, but I mean, fewer people will be confused. So right now the non-goals section is pretty short. Maybe part of this is just making it a little bit larger if we do decide that, for now at least, for example, we're not messing with PVs, so we call that out explicitly. We're not touching PVs here.
Okay, but so that all sounds good to me, but are we at least on the same page that this is like a problem that needs something to be solved here? I get the feeling there's pushback and this is even a problem to be solved.
No, I don't. Well, so no, I'm not saying that's not a problem to be solved. We've certainly gotten enough asks for it. The problem is that it's a really dangerous feature. And that's why I really want to make sure there's a good understanding of what it's going to do before we turn it loose on people.
Yeah, totally with you on the dangerous aspect of it. And I think it's more of like giving users more control, even if it's potentially destructive.
And on the dangerous point is actually why I was, because initially we were talking about, the patch and the delete and recreate as kind of being parallel options to provide. I looked at that and I'm like, look, let's worry about the less risky use cases first, because delete and recreate to me is very dangerous, because I go and delete something because it's different. Now there's a finalizer on the thing, the delete stalls, which means there's no way the restore can recreate the thing. You've now deleted customer data without recreating it from the backup. So that's a dangerous feature, however you implement it. Doesn't mean we shouldn't implement it, but I'm saying we need to be a lot more careful about implementing it. Let's implement the less dangerous subset of this functionality first, and then go from there. So that's why I was proposing, and we've updated the document to say, we will patch things that exist already if the user tells us they want us to, but we don't provide the option in the first iteration of this to delete and recreate things, because that is truly dangerous. And we will eventually want that, but not yet.
Yeah. And if we can get, I'm not sure what Raphael's status is right now, but his team had some similar use cases, so they'd be a good input on this.
I'd also like to bring up one point, which is that certain users do need tools that are foot guns.
Mm-hmm.
It's fair to say that we should protect the user who's just running a restore, and so the default behavior should be sane and safe. But we should also not be resistant to adding features that users need just because they could be foot guns, in my personal opinion. I just like to throw that out there and make sure that we're all like, is that a fair statement that everybody agrees with?
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I think part of it is making sure people realize these are foot guns, because people right now are asking for, hey, I just want to overwrite. And it's like, oh, what do you really want?
Right.
Yeah, and they wanted to do what in their mind would be get me to like having a working cluster. It's like, well, actually, that's not going to get you to a working cluster, because you have these things that move forward and you're rolling these things back, and they're not going to play well together.
I don't disagree that it is a hard problem. I don't disagree with that. I guess I was just saying that, like, there are users out there who know what they need, and those folks, we probably do need to give them the tools, even though some folks are going to have.
Yes,
some people, right? Like, it's a hard balance. It's a hard balance. I don't.
Here's your power saw. maybe you shouldn't be using it to, trim your toenails, right? It's like
Right, exactly. Like people need table saws, but maybe it's not the best idea to use a table saw for your toenail. Right, exactly.
So people need to understand, because they'll see an option. If they just see this option, it's like, ooh, this one does what I want.
Right. So
Great. I think it sounds like we'll go and update the design doc with an explicit section around some use cases that brought to us by customers, as well as fleshing out more detailed description of what exactly this will not support or should not be used for. So we'll get that updated, and then yeah, if you don't mind just taking a look, if you have use cases that you think we definitely should or should not cover on this, please feel free to add as a comment there. And
yeah, I would especially say on anything that other people have had. Dave, you mentioned people have asked for this in the past. If there's any details, for example, because I'm guessing what they've asked you for is probably not exactly the same as what they've asked us for, and so we kind of
yeah, exactly. That's yeah.
And we're pushing this as an upstream first approach, which means we want to handle our use cases, of course, but we want to handle anyone else's use cases that make sense to include here. So if there's anything that we haven't been involved in, there may be additional tweaks or additional aspects that we haven't thought of yet. So that would be good to get that feedback as well.
I think that sounds like a great plan.
What was I thinking about? Yes, next week. So the maintainer team over in China, they're off for the New Year Spring Festival. So we're gonna push next week's community meeting. So we're not gonna have one next week, which is late in the evening here in the US. So we'll just cancel that one, and then we'll be back after that. In roughly 2 weeks, I believe we'll have the next release as well, when the maintainer team in China is back, so we can handle support questions and things like that in a proper way. So that's all that I had. Does anyone have any other discussion topics or anything they want to bring up on the call today?
I was just going to ask Jonas, can you make sure that the maintainer team in China, when they do come back, takes a look at the advancement that we just discussed as well?
Yes.
Gives input.
Yeah, I'll add it to their task list. Yes.
Awesome. Thank you.
Will do. Awesome. All right. So with that, thank you, everyone. Have a fantastic rest of the week, and see you not next week, but in 2 weeks. Have a good one,
See you,
folks.
everybody. Thank you.
Take care. See ya.